Nuclear bombs are the most devastating weapons that mankind has ever created. And at the dawn of the atomic era, people worried that they would soon be everywhere. John F. Kennedy, for example, indicated that up to 20 countries would have nuclear weapons by the middle of the 1960s. Thankfully, we never reached that point. Only 10 countries have ever controlled a nuclear arsenal, and we only have 9 of them that still do today. And to preempt some angry comments, no, Ukraine is not supposed to be on this list, but we will get to that later. Today, we are going to discuss why these countries went that far, and what stopped everyone else from doing so. And if you think it is for lack of ability, you are in for a surprise. We are going to see some intriguing and very weird things get thrown into the mix, like railway strikes, the Albert Einstein, a healthy dose of espionage, distrust of allies, and convoluted ways to trap reluctant partners. This is why every nuclear power built the bomb, and everyone else hasn't. But first, we have discussed before the need to take a break from the serious topics at hand to have a little bit of fun. And if you can do that while learning a little more on the side, all the better. That's why I want to tell you about a game that has become my go-to, today's sponsor, Warpath. Warpath is a game that combines elements of first-person shooters with real-time strategy, and we know how much the word strategy appeals to Lines on Maps enthusiasts. That means you are in control of the battlefield, and you can form your troops with tactics based on the battle situations. There is no time better to join the battle than today, because 2 popular characters from the arcade game Metal Slug 3, Marco Rossi and Eri Kazumoto, are now at your disposal. Marco Rossi can strengthen the damage of troops, and Eri Kazumoto can greatly reduce the enemy's hit rate, and instantly resolve the enemy's key attack. You can join the in-game event to get these officers for free, or choose your favorite character to join these officers' camps to win cash rewards. Of course, you can get deep into the military history, featuring real maps and historical battles with materiel. Yes, I said materiel. Like M2 medium tanks and BM-8 rocket launchers. Choose from 34 types of artillery, 27 types of infantry armaments, and 104 types of tanks overall. And with Metal Slug 3, you can also apply a special unit skin, SV-001, the beloved Metal Slug 3 super vehicle. Warpath and Metal Slug 3 collaboration explodes the mission of Battlefield. Check the link in the description and join me by downloading Warpath now. Let's begin with the countries that have built the bomb, going in chronological order. That means we begin with the United States, which is convenient because the story is easy, but it takes place long enough ago that there are only 48 stars on the flag. In August 1939, Albert Einstein co-authored a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which hit on all the key points. That it was possible to weaponize uranium, that the weapon could completely destroy large targets, that it would be a good idea to get physicists involved in the war industry, and that Nazi Germany may be trying to develop that weapon. 2 months later, FDR sent a thank you note, and authorized preliminary commissions for the United States to work on such a project. Progress was slow-moving until Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. But now officially facing geopolitical opponents, the United States had a clear reason to pour money into what seemed at the time like a risky investment. That led to the creation of the Manhattan Project the following summer. 3 major research facilities were built: Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and Hanford in Washington. 3 years later, the Trinity test officially ushered in the nuclear era, and shortly thereafter, the United States dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The United States would continue working on further nuclear devices in the following decades, and apparently celebrate successes with mushroom cloud cake, but its nuclear monopoly would soon come to an end. The Soviet Union became the next entrant in the nuclear club in 1949. Following World War II, the former Allied relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly broke down, with the recently carved up East and West Germany serving as a fault line, and the Berlin blockade previewing how contentious the relationship would ultimately be. As a result, Stalin ordered a rush to proliferate following the end of the war, banking that the United States and the United Kingdom would not interfere while they were still recovering. Soviet physicists had some help in the matter because of spies that had infiltrated the Manhattan Project and passed along information regarding design and construction. This allowed the Soviet Union to test its first weapon in 1949, years ahead of what US intelligence had anticipated. And if you thought that Moscow would order a nuclear test on Russian soil, you would be wrong. This is Kazakhstan, but we will get to that later. Third on the list was the United Kingdom. British physicists had their own nuclear weapons project during World War II. Its origin was the Maud Committee, bizarrely enough named after Niels Bohr's housekeeper Maud Ray. That evolved into a full-fledged venture analogous to the Manhattan Project, with the delightfully dull name Tube Alloys. Leave it to the British to bore us into a false sense of indifference. However, Nazi Germany was right across the English Channel, and Britain was the target of a sustained bombing campaign during the war. That made keeping the project on the islands dangerous. Thus, under the Quebec Agreement, Tube Alloys became subsumed by the Manhattan Project. In return, Britain received information regarding technical developments, which facilitated the 1952 Operation Hurricane nuclear test. And if you thought that they would do this on the soil of the British Isles, guess again. This occurred in Australia. Fourth on the list is France. With NATO alliance partners, the United States and the United Kingdom already having acquired nuclear weapons, you might think that France doing the same would be superfluous. Charles de Gaulle, however, would disagree. In the event that the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, de Gaulle worried that he would witness a repeat of World War II. France would be outmanned standing alone, and have no choice but to evacuate the continent. Yes, the United States and the United Kingdom would eventually take care of business, but they would take their own sweet time to do so. It is like what Winston Churchill once said: you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted all the other possibilities. Well, de Gaulle felt the same way, except that it applied to Britain just as much as it applied to America. An independent French nuclear weapon was the answer, hence the Jabois Blue test in 1960. And if you thought that they would do this on the French mainland soil, guess again. This was in Algeria. That actually connects to another component of the decision. France's status took a beating from World War II, and then again with the Algerian War. De Gaulle may not have seen France's seat at the United Nations Security Council as enough, but that a nuclear weapon could get him back into the game of international politics. Fifth was the People's Republic of China. By 1961, China had managed the impressive feat of antagonizing both the Cold War superpowers, the United States over the general communism-democracy debate and mutual participation in the Korean War, and the Soviet Union over the finer points of Marxism. The result became known as the Sino-Soviet split. It got so bad that there were brief overtures between Washington and Moscow about whether to do a joint operation to stop China from building a bomb. But the Soviet Union passed, and the United States went nowhere without the help. As a result, China tested its first nuclear weapon in 1964 as a way to deter both of those opponents, and the government was all too happy to announce China's entry as the fifth nuclear power. Brief aside that will matter for later. These were the only 5 countries that had nuclear weapons at the start of negotiations for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As a result, their possession of the weapons is baked into the treaty, and they are sometimes described as the recognized nuclear weapon states. That leaves us with the 5 unrecognized nuclear weapon states in contrast. Continuing in chronological order, the first of these is Israel. Israel faced a strategic problem that none of the first 5 countries encountered. From its independence in 1948, Israel was surrounded by geopolitical rivals. Combine that with the relatively small size of the Israeli state, and you can see why the government was worried about being run over. Nuclear weapons provided the ultimate insurance policy. However, Israel lives in a bizarre world of duality, where there is still no official acknowledgement of its ownership of nuclear weapons. And Israel has no confirmed test either, which makes placing an exact date on Israeli acquisition difficult. Speaking of dates that are difficult to pin down, next up is India. The strategic reason that India sought nuclear weapons was due to ongoing border conflicts with Pakistan and China. Its first test came in 1974, officially titled Pokhran 1, but often dubbed the Smiling Buddha or Happy Krishna, which were two oh-so-cute euphemisms for what they also described as a peaceful nuclear explosion. However, India did not follow up on the test for more than a decade, and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi barely informed her military about the proceedings. As a result, there is plenty of suspicion that Gandhi tested the weapon for domestic political purposes. Her poll numbers were suffering as a result of a 1973 economic recession, and India was in the midst of an ongoing rail strike, which by some measures was the largest labor strife in the history of mankind. The Smiling Buddha changed the media narrative and gave Gandhi a much-needed win. Next on the list is South Africa in 1979, and oh goodness is this one complicated. Development occurred back during the apartheid era. A civil war was ongoing in neighboring Angola between the MPLA and UNITA. South Africa supported UNITA, while Cuba provided troops, and the Soviet Union provided material support to the MPLA. The apartheid government worried that the civil war might spill over into South Africa, and that the United States might waver in intervening because of, the whole apartheid policy thing. Thus, a bizarre scheme was born. South Africa would build a nuclear weapon, but then not tell anyone about it. I guess that every administration has limits on how much negative international PR it is willing to take. If the Civil War were to have spilled over, you would think South Africa would have then fired them at Angola. But nope. Once the border was crossed, the plan was to then reveal the nuclear arsenal. That would compel the United States to reluctantly intervene, so as to keep South Africa's bombs in the basement. When the apartheid government gave up power, though, it did not want the successor government to keep the nuclear weapons. And thus, South Africa became the first and only country to give up a nuclear arsenal. And no, Ukraine still does not count here, though we are getting close to finally discussing that point. Ninth on the list is Pakistan. There is not much to add here. Pakistan trailed India in technical capacity, and thus did not immediately respond to the Smiling Buddha. But when tensions flared again in the 1980s, India got serious about weaponizing its own nuclear technology, and by 1998, Pakistan tested its first nuclear weapon. And consequently, the leaders of India and Pakistan won the sarcastic version of the Nobel Peace Prize that year for their increasingly aggressive, peaceful detonations of nuclear weapons. North Korea is last up. Nobody really likes North Korea on the international stage. China only tolerates the Kim dynasty because it wants a buffer with the West. And Russia has been cuddling up only recently because Moscow desperately needs artillery for its invasion of Ukraine. All alone on its diplomatic island, North Korea saw nuclear weapons as a critical way to maintain its presence on the peninsula. For all the discussion of North Korea's massive army, remove the nuclear weapons, and South Korea would dominate in a conventional war because of its financial and technological advantages, never mind the shadow of Western support. Nuclear weapons therefore provide the regime insurance that the Kim dynasty seeks so much. And that does it for all 10 of the nuclear powers. But this is a video on why every nuclear power built the bomb, and everyone else did not, so we are only halfway done here. And there are 3 countries that serve as a nice bridge between the categories: Belarus, Kazakhstan, and yes, finally, Ukraine. They are famous for having hosted nuclear arsenals on their soil at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse. With Ukraine, Its 1990 stockpile was particularly impressive, only surpassed worldwide by the United States and Russia. Also, what a crazy time the Cold War was to be alive. Anyway, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a common narrative was that Ukraine naively gave up its weapons back in the 1990s, out of a false sense of trust in Moscow. The reality, though, is very different. In principle, the legacy Soviet nuclear weapons were only supposed to be used after consultation among the successor states. In practice, none of the three countries had command and control over the nuclear weapons on their soil. Rather, the stockpiles were held and guarded by troops loyal to Moscow. A rough analogy would be if Montana were to suddenly divorce itself from the rest of the United States tomorrow. Would Montana become a nuclear power? Unless the governor actually has a metaphorical button to press, then no, not really. Yes, there are nuclear weapons in Montana, but the metaphorical button is in the Oval Office. At the same rate, the United States having forward-deployed nuclear weapons stationed in Germany does not give Olaf Scholz the ultimate power either. When Ukraine and the other two gave up their nuclear weapons, what was really happening was more of a deal to resolve an awkward geopolitical position. Ukraine could not have taken the weapons by force. That would have required killing Russian loyal soldiers who had nuclear weapons. Even if Kyiv somehow managed to accomplish that at one of the 5 missile sites, scientists would have then needed to gut the weapons and rework them into something useful due to safety features. Instead, Ukraine's geographic positioning, that is, its ability to surround the sites, meant that Kyiv could extract concessions out of Moscow. Specifically, the uranium in the devices would be extracted, and then returned to Ukraine to fuel the country's many nuclear power plants. There was still the possibility that each country could develop its own native program, but neither the United States nor Russia was too keen on that. Thus came the economic pressure. Money if they forswore nuclear weapons, and sanctions if they did not. Belarus agreed quickly because it would soon return to being a satellite of Moscow anyway, and Lukashenko would stick around in the long term to make sure Belarus followed through on that. Kazakhstan did too, because of a general distaste for nuclear weapons, after having hosted the Soviet Union's testing grounds. Kyiv held out for longer, but the Soviet Union had left Ukraine's economy in a mess, so Kyiv eventually ended its protest. This was all codified in a document called the Budapest Memorandum. It traded the three countries' membership in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for, among other things, assurances that Moscow would not use military force against them, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. Fast forward almost 3 decades, and you now have narratives that Ukraine was either stupid or naive. Stupid for having given up its nuclear weapons so easily, or naive for having trusted another state based on a promise written on a flimsy piece of paper, even though that goes against International Relations 101. Like, literally, it is International Relations 101. Heck, it is even the 3rd topic of that class, and the first is just an introduction, and the second is what defines states in the international system. Actually, none of this criticism is new. There were the same cries after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, though that received substantially less press coverage. To be clear, if you look back at the language of the memorandum, whether Russia violated the deal is pretty black and white, but the rest of this narrative is inaccurate. Kyiv did not just give away nuclear weapons. It never had access to them. And regarding naivete, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk knew exactly how valuable words on a paper are. His reaction to the Budapest Memorandum? If tomorrow Russia goes into Crimea, no one will raise an eyebrow. Maybe Russian President Boris Yeltsin indeed planned to uphold the pledge over the long term, but Yeltsin was not president for the long term. and at least one party involved has lived to regret it, with Bill Clinton believing that Ukrainian nukes would have had a tangible effect on the current conflict. In any case, Russia's announcement of a war ultimately proved correct the suspicions of Kravchuk. But Ukraine went through with the agreement nevertheless, because the economic alternatives at the time were worse. But what about everyone else? Why didn't we get 20 nuclear weapon states by 1970, never mind by 2023? A tempting explanation is a capacity story, that building any nuclear technology is really hard, so few actually get to the point of weaponization. And indeed, there are a ton of steps in the process: mining uranium, milling it into yellowcake, converting it into a gas, purifying it in centrifuges, or trying to skip some of that by running it through a reactor and then extracting out some fissile plutonium. But regardless, eventually you are going to have to assemble the device in order for it to go boom. And truth be told, capacity is something that the non-proliferation regime tries to restrain, especially the part where the fuel becomes fissile. That is why there was a major scandal when a Pakistani scientist sold these centrifuges to Libya. But it turns out that difficulty is not the complete answer. A single satellite photo illustrates the basic point. This is the Korean Peninsula. Well, technically this is South Korea. That right there is Seoul and surrounding regions. This, meanwhile, well, what you do not see here is North Korea. Yes, you have a tiny dot for Pyongyang, and there is a line for the demilitarized zone, but even that up there is China. If North Korea was capable of building nuclear weapons, but is almost invisible from space in the middle of the night, then certainly a whole bunch more countries could build a bomb if they really wanted to. Exactly how many is hard to quantify. I should know. I spent way too much time earlier in my career gathering data to try to find out. But if we measure nuclear capacity generally, not whether a country has actually built or tried to build a weapon, but rather their ability to do so, and use North Korea's score in 2001 as a baseline for a country 5 years before its initial test, we end up with about 70 weapon-capable states. That is a ton more than the 9 that actually have them. I think Egypt's story helps illustrate a major part of it. In the 1960s and 1970s, Egypt made various claims that appeared headed down the road toward nuclear proliferation. Israel continued to be a rival, and had some not-so-secret nuclear weapons. But then the Camp David Accords led to improved relations, notably including the transfer of the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. Egypt got what it wanted, which obviated the need to pay a bunch of money to produce nuclear weapons, and then go back to the bargaining table with greater coercive capability. And indeed, the idea of concessions for weapons is a key part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Rather than it being about land, though, member states get access to nuclear technology in exchange for continued compliance with the non-proliferation commitment. As an extreme version of this, Argentina and Brazil, two of the most capable non-weapon states, chose to pool their civilian nuclear efforts rather than begin a geopolitical rivalry over the fate of the South American continent. Sometimes those concessions conveniently come along with existing alliance structures. Helmut Kohl, the last West German chancellor during the Cold War, once remarked that there was little reason for Germany to build a nuclear weapon, when he could just make a phone call to Paris, or London, or Washington. He was not alone. In fact, a ton of the 70 nuclear-capable countries are in NATO, and thus chose not to spend a ton of money on a new weapon system, when they can defer that burden to one of the 3 in-house alliance partners. Over on the other side of the world, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan similarly relied on US military leadership. When Richard Nixon briefly told them that US military aid had left the building, the predictable thing then happened. Each hinted that they would be interested in developing a nuclear weapon, and the United States then backtracked and reaffirmed their commitments to stop that. Now, if you are thinking to yourself, gee, this sounds a lot like a lines on maps bargaining problem. For one thing, welcome back to the channel. But for another, you are right. Building nuclear weapons is inefficient, so it stands to reason that there should always be a settlement that leaves both parties better off. In turn, the explanations for those proliferating states are solid historical narratives, but they do not meet a true social science standard. However, getting that deep would require a video of its own, or maybe a dissertation I wrote once upon a time. But even aside from those bargaining concerns, for another group of states, it is just a raw cost calculation. Somehow, at some point, nuclear weapons got a reputation of being a cheap alternative to conventional arms. That is misleading. Over the first 5+ decades in the nuclear era, the United States spent $5.8 trillion on its nuclear weapons program. That is more than expenditures on income security, interest on the national debt, or Medicare. In fact, the only things that exceeded nuclear spending were Social Security and conventional defense. In terms of current money, that is $10.72 trillion. Granted, not all countries building nuclear weapons would want a program as large as the United States is, and they can free ride to some extent on design. But no other country has the wealth or industrial capacity to absorb that damage either, and less than 10% of the US expenditures went toward building the bomb. The vast majority of the cost is on maintenance and deployment, which any new nuclear weapons state has to pay for. Thus, if you want to build a nuke, you had better be getting a lot of bang for your buck. That takes a ton of other countries off the board. Anyone without a significant geopolitical rivalry simply cannot justify the price tag. But countries with a decent amount of cash to blow on nukes face a different problem. Being an integrated part of the global economy is a prerequisite for that level of wealth, which means the rest of the world can simply play the economic sanctions card against you. We have seen what that can do to a country like Russia. Now imagine that you are not a primary commodity exporter, so you cannot find anyone to offload your gas to. Or maybe you are just a smaller country with a tighter budget as it is. Again, more countries come off the board, even if they have an antagonist that they would like to use a nuclear weapon against. Finally, there is the preventive war concern. When Saddam Hussein began work on a nuclear reactor outside of Baghdad in the 1980s, Israel did not take kindly to it. Thus began Operation Opera. A group of F-16A fighters flew to Iraq and bombed the site. Even years afterward, it remained in complete disarray. When the United States had the false impression that Saddam was back at it in 2003, the coalition of the willing this time went all the way, for the better or for the worse. When Israel found another nuclear facility, this time in Syria in 2007, Operation Outside the Box effectively became Operation Opera 2.0. Put bluntly, countries that cannot protect their nuclear facilities cannot complete a bomb project. And that takes us to Iran. Iran grows ever closer to having completed the technical prerequisites to build a bomb. Of course, we have been hearing for decades that Iran is X number of months or years away from doing so, and all of those assessments have been wrong thus far. But we have also discussed before how this is not purely a physics question. The final decision is ultimately a political one. Part of that depends on expectations regarding future relations with the United States. Part of that depends on whether Tehran expects Israel to attempt a preventive operation, which will be much harder than an Iraq or Syria situation because of the longer distance, and because Iran has put some of its facilities underground. In any case, Iran is the most likely 10th contemporary nuclear state, and 11th overall. And if that happens, we may need to revisit the situation for some other countries. How long do you think it will be before Iran builds a nuclear weapon, if ever? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. I think I just discovered a new record for longest unnoticed Easter egg on this channel, and probably one that will never be broken. I myself had forgotten about it until I was animating the slide referencing International Relations 101. Do you see it? When I made that series 12 years ago, the thumbnail meta of large emotive faces was not yet a thing. So I designed a consistent cover with a bunch of flags. We have the big players, like the United States, there's China, France, a retro throwback to the Soviet Union, and even Ukraine is there, as if to foreshadow where this channel would go more than a decade later. But then there is this. What on earth is that flag? The answer is the Principality of Sealand. Okay, sounds like a reasonable micronation. But then you zoom in and find out that, well, it's not there. I encourage you to check out the Wikipedia page for the full explanation. But the short version of it is that one day someone who came from the because I said so school of international relations thought occupied an abandoned oil rig and declared it his own country. And you know that they mean business when they have a Latin motto. Anyway, for the last 12 years, I suppose that this here hack has lent legitimacy to those claims by putting its flag on a thumbnail.